Hi everyone, Sarah McBride here, National Press Secretary at the Human Rights Campaign. Thank you so much for joining us for this Facebook Live chat on LGBT inclusion in education here in the United States. I'm going to let folks have a few seconds to join us, but joining me here at the HRC headquarters in Washington, D.C. are a few of my colleagues. On the far right is Sarah Warbelow, HRC's Legal Director. Next to Sarah is Leslie Hall, manager of HRC's HBCU project. And next to Leslie, right next to me, is Joanna Eager, director of HRC's Welcoming Schools program. Earlier today and yesterday, we've had up on the website a back-to-school guide for parents, teachers, and allies of transgender students to really use as a resource to make sure that their schools are inclusive as possible. I look forward to talking to Joanna a bit more about that later in this conversation. But we also want to have a conversation about the current landscape of LGBTQ equality in our schools. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then my colleagues are going to switch out. We're going to have a friend of HRC, J.R. Ford, who's part of HRC's Dads for Transgender Equality, join us to talk about this issue from a slightly more personal perspective. But let's start with the three of you. I'm really excited to have you joining us for this conversation. I also want to say if you have comments or questions, feel free to add those in the Facebook comment thread. We'll try to answer as many of those as possible. As I mentioned yesterday, we released a back-to-school guide, which folks can check out at hrc.im/back-to-school. And it has a lot of really great information, a lot of tools. But we also released it amidst a really widespread conversation in this country around LGBT equality in schools, particularly transgender equality in schools. And Joanna, I'm curious, sort of from your perspective as someone who works with schools so frequently, what's that landscape look like? What's the reality for students as they're going back to school right now?
That's a complicated question with a complicated answer because we are at a point in time where we're doing better by our LGBTQ students than we have in the past. For example, we have more GSAs than we've ever had before in the nation. We have more teachers who are aware of LGBTQ students and families than ever before. At the same time, we all suffered the report from the CDC that was released this August that showed that LGBTQ students are 2 to 3 times more likely to miss school because they don't feel safe at school, for example. And so there still is very much a crisis in this nation when it comes to supporting LGBTQ students in schools. So it's both. We have really good things going on. For example, Welcoming Schools has more calls from school districts asking us to come in and do professional development with teachers that's LGBTQ and gender inclusive than we've ever had before. So there's more interest in schools and more investment by schools to do this. We go into schools and do what we call single district trainings, where we go in and train educators in the school to provide Welcoming Schools professional development to the entire school for multiple years. And the first school that approached us was actually a school in the South. So I don't even want to get into saying it's based upon region, because sometimes we see schools in a very difficult part of the country actually bringing us in to work with them. Part of what's going on, though, in the nation around LGBTQ students is we tend to call it a safe schools movement. And so while we're striving to make schools safer for LGBTQ students, we also know that that's not the end. Like, we want so much more for our LGBTQ students. So we're working on safety, but what we really want is the opportunity for LGBTQ students to be able to thrive, to be healthy, to feel absolutely engaged in the academic environment, to be well socially. So we've got a long ways to go.
Well, and I think what's clear also is an important part of making sure that our schools are safe spaces is for localities, schools, states, and the federal government to adopt inclusive non-discrimination protections. And Sarah, I want to bring you into this conversation here on that topic in particular, because last spring, the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Department of Education released guidance that got a lot of attention in the media around treatment of transgender students. I think there's a lot of confusion and curiosity as people are going back to school is what was that guidance and where does it stand right now?
Yeah. So a lot of people think that this guidance was a new law in the United States. But actually what the departments were doing was responding to questions from school districts all over the country who were asking, what are our obligations under existing law? We have a law called Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Most people know it as the law that ensured that women and girls could play sports in this country. But it does so much more. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex for any educational institution that accepts federal funds. Colleges, preschool programs. If you're taking federal money, if you're a public school, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. By necessity, that means you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, right? It's just absolutely clear that if you're going to engage in sex stereotypes and assume that people have to behave a certain way because of the sex they were assigned at birth, or you have expectations because of someone's sex and who they should be dating, that is a form of sex discrimination. So the Departments of Justice and Education just made completely clear that if you are discriminating against transgender students, you're in violation of the law. And they help schools understand what that means. That means you absolutely have to allow trans students to use restrooms and locker rooms consistent with gender identity. But it means so much more as well. That's been the focus publicly. It also means you can't harass transgender students. You can't out a student who's transgender. You have to respect people's names and pronouns. Now, what's happened most recently is that there have been some court cases on this. And unfortunately, a judge in Texas said the Department of Justice cannot sue people over this guidance anywhere in the country. We expect that that will change, but in the meantime, nothing is stopping schools from implementing that guidance. And if students experience discrimination, they absolutely can sue in federal court to ensure that their school district stops treating them inappropriately.
And I think it's important to note that those protections are not just K through 12, they also apply to post-secondary institutions that receive federal funds, which is where I want to bring in Leslie, who helps manage our HBCU project here. And Leslie, I'm curious, based on your work, your experience as a recent graduate as well, like myself, what's the reality on college campuses for LGBTQ students, and obviously the reality including on HBCU campuses?
Certainly, sure. So as Joanna was alluding to, the landscape is getting much better for LGBTQ students in academic settings, just in general. Schools are taking a more proactive approach with creating safe zones. They are creating more support services for students, and that's just generally. There are still some challenges, though, as it relates to residence life on campus. Many LGBTQ students aren't fully comfortable with the process, with just trying to get on-campus housing. So many LGBTQ students are a bit uncomfortable when it comes time to the health services on campus. When you go into the Health and Wellness Center, you might have a issue that you want to go check out, but the privacy really isn't there, and they're not always responsive to pronouns and things like that in the health center. So those are some challenges, and also with the counseling and support services. The university might have a counselor that isn't LGBTQ competent, and that can present some issues as well if the counselor isn't responsive or inclusive or safe with his or her therapeutic messages that they might send to the students. As it relates to HBCUs, HBCU students face a unique challenge in that, because we have to navigate the intersection of being not only gay but black, and those two come with its own issues as it relates to walking this line. And so HBCUs, similar to the broader black community, many of the schools are grounded Many of the universities were started by religious denominations, and they take root in historically black colleges. So it's one of those feels like don't ask, don't tell. You know, like we know you're there. You know, we're not going to make too much fuss about you as long as you don't make too much fuss about yourself. And that, contrary to what Joanna said about the public school system, in the university setting, it's really kind of segregated in terms of geographical areas. Like I attended two HBCUs above Virginia, you know, in Maryland and in DC, and my HBCUs were great. But as the further south that you get, you tend to see a whole lot more lack of inclusion and lack of policies to protect students. And just, you know, she was sharing about the laws, the guidance. You know, I was in North Carolina when Loretta Lynch made that huge statement about to Governor Pat McCrory, and I was in North Carolina a lot of organizing HBCU students there against this bill. And so North Carolina, you know, was in a hard place because I was at schools where the university was like, we're not gonna, you know, enforce this law. And then you have the president of the system and then the governor saying, oh, you better. And then you have the Justice Department saying, well, if you do, you will lose your funding. And that could impact HBCUs in a terrible way. So I would say that, again, not just at HBCUs, but across the nation, higher education is getting a lot better, but we still have a long way to go.
And there's a point you brought up that I'm going to want to come back to, but first you also talked about Loretta Lynch and the federal lawsuits. But I want to come back to Sarah to talk also about the landscape of protections at the district, local, and state level for students, because there are a number of states that have passed protections. A lot of districts are proactively adopting inclusive policies. So I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about what we're seeing right now beyond federal protections at the state and the local level.
So we've seen a real patchwork of laws around the country. This is true for non-discrimination laws, not only in education, but housing and employment. And what we're talking about are those laws that explicitly say you absolutely cannot discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Where states have failed to act, we've really seen individual school districts, oftentimes spurred because they're aware that students in their district are LGBTQ, and they want to do the right things by their students. They want to put protections in place so that teach individual bad actors, a particular teacher isn't engaging in harassment, and those teachers who want to do the right thing know how to step up and provide the support for students. So we are seeing all across the country an increasing number of school districts, it seems like one every week, adding in very explicit protections. And they are using the recommendations of the Justice Department often as a model, but more importantly, they're also looking to products like Welcoming Schools to help them understand how do you implement this and how do you do it in a robust way.
Well, and I also want to add that they've been adopting these policies and there haven't been any problems.
Zero problems.
There's no issue with trans students using restrooms like some of the anti-LGBTQ extremists and politicians claim. So I want to come back to this point that you mentioned about, when talking specifically about HBCUs, which is that LGBTQ students of color, in bringing their whole selves to school, face both anti-LGBTQ bias as well as racism. And Joanna has also worked on issues of racism in her work as well. And so I'm wondering if the two of you can sort of delve a little bit deeper into some of the unique challenges that LGBTQ young people of color face in our schools. Joanna, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. You know, when I think about that intersectionality, of course, what that means is that the more marginalized identities that a student has, then that puts them at more risk. And even with regard to the CDC survey, the survey surveyed LGB students and didn't include transgender students. At least this time, we hope they will in the future. And we know that transgender students, for example, will be even more at risk. And now you add on the fact that a person is a person of color and they're LGBTQ, maybe they have a disability, and so we know the risk factors climb. With regard to race specifically in schools, one of our biggest concerns is what's called the school to prison pipeline. And that there are situations that students of color, and certainly more so students of color who identify as LGBTQ are at risk. So they're at risk of being unfairly suspended or suspended at higher rates than white students are. There's a stereotype threat going on with these students. Educators may be carrying ideas that a student is a troublemaker, maybe based upon their gender expression, seen with the color of their skin, and they're out of that school pretty fast. And so what ends up happening is that with these marginalized identities and these intersections, that what happens to students is that they get into a place where they're almost being pushed out of school and pushed into that school to prison pipeline or into juvenile detention by educators, by lower expectations, etc.
I think one of the interesting things that you talked about, and Leslie, I'd love to hear your thoughts, is this notion of the school to prison pipeline and disproportionate disciplinary action against LGBTQ students. For instance, if a student is defending themselves against bullying, including violent bullying, if it's an LGBTQ student of color, oftentimes they will face discipline because they defended themselves. Leslie, what are your thoughts on that intersection?
Certainly, and so just to start at the point that you were making, that's why it's so important to have culturally competent and LGBTQ competent folks on these campuses, is because if I am LGBTQ competent and I see a gay student, always getting into trouble because it's some type of violent or physical issue, then that automatically, or at least I would automatically assume that, maybe I have to look at the environment, or go deeper into the circumstances in which the student is getting into these altercations, and it would prevent me from automatically writing off the student as a troublemaker. Going deeper into the intersection, Joanna made some great points, and I think I want to take it a step further, because when I talk about the intersection, I mean that because you don't have much racism on HBCU campus, okay? But what we have to understand is that the intersection means that not only am I have to worry about this whole education thing, but also HBCUs now have to worry about the social determinants of health. African American gay men are at a much higher level of contracting HIV than other folks. And so if I'm an HBCU and I know that I have a good population of LGBTQ folks on campus, then that's something else I have to worry about. Then I have to worry about, well, are my gay, lesbian, LGBTQ students, when they leave campus, do they have a place to stay? Because again, many of us will leave and to go, and we love to come to college because at least we're guaranteed housing for a semester, but we could have been put out of our homes because of us trying to be our real and true selves, our families or what have you. So that's something else, a housing issue. And then income, being able to find a job once you graduate, especially if you're in the Deep South where they have all these religious freedom bills and all that other stuff that's happening down there. Can I find a job once I graduate? So HBCUs, similar to the Black church, are always at the root or at the center of all of these different dynamics, or at the center of this intersection where, just like back in the civil rights, the folks would go to the Black church because that was the only place that we could organize safely at times. And so HBCUs serve as that model. And so HBCUs are really stretched thin with trying to make sure all of those areas are covered. But so often, more often than not, they fail because it's this thing where, we are afraid of what our board of trustees might think if we take a stance on this. Like, it's been really hard for me, and I'll end on this point. Like, it's been a challenge for me to get university HBCU presidents to make statements against HB2 or other bad bills that might be happening in neighboring states. And so they don't want to ruffle any feathers on their board. They don't want to ruffle any feathers in the state legislature where their budget lies in the in the brink, or whatever the case is. So it's really navigating a lot of different things when we talk about the challenges facing LGBTQ students at HBCUs.
So it sort of seems like to me this landscape is there's unprecedented support for LGBTQ students and equality, but at the same time, with increased visibility, with increased attention, with sort of the controversies that have been percolating over the last several months in particular, there's also unprecedented challenges
Absolutely.
for students. And so I want to hear from I think Sarah and Joanna talk about what are some next steps, what are some tangible actions that we can take, that viewers can take. And I'll start with Sarah on the policy legislative front. What are some things that people should do or support to make sure that we are creating inclusive schools?
So, I mean, there's a range of options. I mean, the first one is vote. You need to vote. And you need to vote up and down the ticket, right? It matters who's president. It matters who's controlling political appointees at the Department of Justice, at the Department of Education. But it also matters who's on your local school board. So you need to make sure that you're well informed and that you're taking those steps to be engaged in voting. The second is show your support at the municipal, state, and federal level for legislation that's pending that will make it absolutely clear to the courts that under any circumstance, LGBTQ students should be protected. The Equality Act and the Student Non-Discrimination Act are two bills at the federal level that will absolutely guarantee non-discrimination protections in every circumstance that a young person faces. So really being proactive is incredibly important. And then talking about issues, making sure that people are informed and that you're asking others to engage with you.
That's great. And Joanna, I mentioned this at the start, you just released,
Yes.
and your team, this great back to school guide with a lot of tangible steps that schools can take. Again, you can find it at hrc.im/backtoschool. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some steps that parents, teachers, administrators, school board members can take to make sure that their schools are inclusive and welcoming places for everyone.
Yeah, great. I would love to. In part because the guide that we put together, we have so many materials and resources, and so folks can go to welcomingschools.org and download and just find a plethora of resources that are free for educators and for parents. However, the guide itself is specifically for, out of all the materials and resources we have, we chose pieces in the guide that are specific for starting the school year. So I'd like to highlight some aspects of the guide. As well, I noticed that there was a question, in particular there was a question about, is Welcoming Schools in Wisconsin? And yes, we're in Wisconsin. It depends though upon the district or the school that asks to bring us in. And there was a question also about like, how do we get in touch with you and how can we bring Welcoming Schools into our school, which we get asked all the time. So there is on the Welcoming Schools website at www.welcomingschools.org where you can find a link that says request a training. And if you fill that out, then that comes into the Welcoming Schools team. And then we actually have consultants across the nation that can deliver the Welcoming Schools professional development modules to your school. And so that's a way to get in touch with us. And then someone on our team will get back in touch with you. And then what's great about those of you who are interested is that we just need the contact. We need a parent, we need a teacher, we need a school administrator, just someone who's interested in the program coming to the school. And once we have that, then that person can kind of be a liaison and get us introduced, and then we can make the magic happen. With regard to the back to school guidance, some specific steps that educators and parents can take, I just want to highlight some of what's in this guide. One of the documents is actions LGBTQ parents and guardians can take to support their children in elementary school. And there are it's just full of suggestions. One that I really like is that actually the parent can talk with their child at home about the types of questions that they either have been asked or anticipate that the child may be asked, for example, by their peers. And practice what would be a response that works for that family. Granted, the responses are going to be different for every family. So maybe for your family, if a question that gets asked of your child at school is, you know, it's weird that you have two moms, which one is the real one? which, you know, could be a curious question from an elementary student. And then you can practice at home how your child's going to respond. It might be, you know, both moms are my real moms, and they love me, and we're a family together. And there are all sorts of family structures in this classroom. And what does your family structure look like? Just you know, we all have differences. With regard to the professional development modules that I mentioned, you can find that in the Welcoming Schools Back to School Guide as well, and it just lists all of the different types of professional development that we can come in and provide to a school district. A couple of the modules, we have one around creating LGBTQ inclusive schools, we have one around addressing gender in schools, and I just want to say too, with regard to gender, while we certainly want to support our transgender students and non-binary students, also we really believe that doing the work around gender is for all students in all of our schools. We all have a gender, we're all impacted and limited by the gender binary. Most educators were raised in the gender binary, the culture still reinforces the gender binary, so we all need to do this work regardless of if you have an out trans student in your school or not. And so we also have in the guide a document called Gender and Children, A Place to Begin, and it just has a long list of classroom practices that teachers can use, as well as ideas for how teachers can intervene in the teachable moment, just because we're finding that teachers have had little or no experience or training around how do I intervene when a comment's being made, for example, that's limiting another student based upon gender. So for example, if a comment's made, you know, she's a girl, why is she always playing with the boys? We have the teachers stand up in our trainings and practice responses to that, because there are many appropriate responses to that, but sometimes if we don't practice, we may miss that moment to respond effectively. So I know our time is short, I could keep going on, but please do check out the guide. There are also 2 lesson plans in here. They're specifically for back to school that encourages students to have conversations with each other about what it is that helps them to feel safe and welcome in school and what doesn't, so that they can start their school year thinking about those practices themselves.
Well, and I think what's great about your answer is that it really reinforces all of those points that you made. I think really reinforce that this isn't just about abstract policies. This isn't about federal power. This is about everyday actions that LGBTQ students and the children of LGBTQ parents have to face, everyday indignities that they may have to face, that we need to address. And we need to make sure that every student, whether they're LGBTQ or not, feels that they can live up to their God-given potential and have a safe and quality education. So thank you all so much for your work on this issue and so many other issues. That concludes our first part. I'm now going to ask these panelists to step away and make some room for J.R. Ford, who is a friend of HRC, a parent advocate, the father of a transgender daughter, and part of HRC's Dads for Transgender Equality. There's a wonderful video of JR and other dads, as well as just a video about JR that you can find. We'll be posting a link to it. But I'll welcome up JR right now. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hello, JR. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Your work as a transgender person, I just want to thank you, your spouse, and so many other parents for your work around trans equality. I think I can say this as a trans person, that one of the most difficult things about this debate is that people forget the humanity behind the issue. People forget that transgender people are people that laugh and love and cry and hope and fear and dream just like everyone else. We have siblings, we have parents, we have kids, we have friends and coworkers. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And I guess we could start with just tell us a little bit about your family and your story.
Sure. So our trans daughter Ellie is 5, spunky, charismatic kid. We have a cisgender son, Ronnie. He is 6, and my wife and myself, we all live in D.C. and love our city and love our community, and we're really happy to be a part of HRC and to give another voice to this conversation so that everyone can feel as inclusive as possible. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. So, I want to start with some basics for folks because I think people sometimes forget that for transgender people, a lot of us, we've known forever, right? I've known since as long as I can remember. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of just briefly speak about your own family's journey in finding out about Ellie and understanding, gaining information around transgender identities and sort of that process that it was for you and your wife.
Sure. So I would say, Ellie transitioned about 1.5 years ago. However, it was before that we understood that something was different about Ellie. Vanessa and I are pretty liberal parents, and the test was, how liberal are we when it comes to accepting our kids for who they were and who they are. So that was a big test, and we allowed her to be herself, and she's been able to discuss and describe her feelings to a certain extent because she's still 5. But that sparked the interest in our family to really start to educate ourselves on what are some of the challenges, what are some of the issues that Ellie might face when she gets older, because we're hearing stories in the news and we're just reading up on a lot of information that is detrimental to trans kids and trans adults as well. So my wife has been the main spearhead of the family for this, but it was I took it upon myself to really just get more interested in supporting our kids, and especially supporting Ellie. She's in her own little bubble, and it's our duty to make sure that she's safe, she's protected, she's loved, and so that really helped to charge us to step out there and put ourselves out there, because we don't know who we will impact with our message. And so the least that we could do was, we're in Washington, D.C., where there are some laws on the books that help to support transgender kids and adults. And so this is our opportunity to push that discussion forward and put the message out there that, from the community on up, you can support, trans kids and trans adults.
So I know when I came out, my parents are progressive people. I was a little older than Ellie. I was 21 when I came out, but it was still a challenge for them, and they were more than anything else just so scared. They were scared about what people would say about our family. They were scared about my future and my safety. And so I'm wondering, and I know this is difficult, if you could talk a little bit about your own fears when Ellie came out and as she began to transition, both for when she would start school, but also just in the general world.
Sure. When Ellie first came out to us and told us she was a girl, there was a part of me that was afraid because I didn't understand what this was all about, because it was a totally new world for me. But at the same time, I knew that I had to support her. And so, Ronnie was the first to change pronouns and call her by her name that she wanted to give herself. And then it was myself and then Vanessa, but at the same time, there had to be a concerted effort on our part to put in supports. She was going to a new school for the upcoming school year, so we had to put out a letter to the administration as well as family and friends. They didn't know about Ellie, transitioning, so we had to create another letter for our family and friends, and so it took a lot of effort, took a lot of tears, but it was something that we had to do, and we're really lucky that Ellie's school is really progressive. They were completely accepting of her from day one, and so that was a huge sigh of relief for us that she was going to be safe, she's going to be protected in school. She had a community there that was in full support of her and in full support of us. And so over the course of the next year and a half up to now, we've become progressively more involved, with HRC and with our other organizations, just so we can start to fill in those gaps. There are kids, there are adults that are not being supported, and it saddens me that that's still the case. And we live in a society that we need to be inclusive, and so Ellie's been that spark for me to make sure that, regardless of race, culture, that people are included in everything, in every part of society, because our nation is unfortunately built on excluding people, and we have a really long history of doing that, and we just need to continue to stand up for people's rights, because everyone's a human being at the end of the day. So I was thinking about that today. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. We should all be treated fairly, and we should help each other out. And so that's why I feel that me being a dad, me being a person of color, I have a lot of complexities, that I'm trying to tackle. And so if I can be that voice for people out there who are having challenges, who are having concerns about, how do I tackle this as a parent or as a teenager, I would like to help them by continuing to let them know that there are people out there who can support them. We have Facebook, we have all these different types of social media outlets. And I'm loving that, on the panel before us, that, schools are getting more involved. The Welcoming Schools team, I think they're doing a really great job. And to hear, Leslie's team on HBCUs they're starting to become more involved. That's a community. That's a community that's built around supporting, kids who are kids, and adults. So that's my main thing, is just treating people fairly, treating people right, helping people out.
Well, you said that Leslie, or that Ellie was your spark, and I think it's clear where that comes from. That spark that she has comes from you and your wife. And as someone who came out and had support from my family, I know how important that is for transgender people of any age to experience. So I want to thank you for that. You touched on this, and I really want to belabor this point, because I really do think that it's one that needs to be driven home. There's this national conversation happening. There is this toxic and really hurtful debate. If you could talk to Pat McCrory, the governor of North Carolina, who passed HB 2, whose legislation would ban, if you and Ellie were living in North Carolina, Ellie from using the restroom at her public charter school, what would you say to him? What do you want Pat McCrory to know?
Excuse me. I think, I would want him to know that I say this to Ronnie and Ellie every day about, if you're not helping, you're hurting. And legislation like that is not helping anybody. It's not creating a positive environment for kids who are trying to be authentic, to be real. They just want to go to the bathroom, they want to use the locker rooms. That's all they want to do. And to hear that, Governor McCrory is really supportive of this bill that really excludes a lot of kids who are trying to live their lives as themselves. That's just it goes against all the tenets of helping people out, to treating people fairly. Even in the religious arena,
The golden rule.
the golden rule: you treat people fairly as much as you can. And so I would just continue to say it's just fundamentally wrong.
It's bullying.
Yeah.
And adults should know better.
Right.
What you mentioned that your school and your educational experience has been very positive. Could you talk a little bit about the steps that you hope schools take to incorporate transgender students?
Sure. So, a year and a half ago, we went through the DC lottery for schools, and we had a small selection of schools that we wanted to have Ellie attend, and we saw one on the list, and we said, "Oh, this is a really, really great school. We've heard some great things about it. They're really, really progressive. They're really inclusive, and I mean inclusive in multiple ways, just not in the transgender issues, but also in they have inclusivity with kids who have physical disabilities, mental disabilities. They have an all-inclusive classroom where no one is separated out of the instruction. So when we went to the administration at Ellie's school, we just happened to show up at the right time where they were updating some of their policies on being more inclusive for LGBTQ students. So we sat down with them, and it was part of our initiative was to, if they hadn't been educating their administration, their teachers, we wanted to provide that as well, and we actually did that this past year, which was a really, really great opportunity, and we have another opportunity to go back and also just do a follow-up. So again, I go back to the community aspect of school, of your employment. You spend so much time in these different silos. For schools, they have to be inclusive. It's just the right thing to do. If you're excluding kids based on their sexual identity or their gender identity or their sexual orientation, it's just so fundamentally wrong. We have laws in place. I'm upset that we have to have laws in place for these things to be right, but at the same time, we need these protections for everyone.
Well, and I think it's clear. I think anyone who's ever lived knows that it's difficult not to bring your whole self to your school. It's difficult to not bring your whole self to work. And when you feel like you can't, you don't do as well.
Right.
And that's what this is about. And I want to thank you again for coming here, for having this conversation, for all of the work your family is doing to make sure that Ellie and I can live in a welcoming world. Can I give you a hug?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
And for all of you who tuned in, thank you so much. I think this was a great conversation with both our first panel and, of course, with JR. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to continue to ask in the comments. We'll try to answer and provide resources. A reminder that we have this great Welcoming Schools resource that you can find at hrc.im/backtoschool. You can also just visit hrc.org to find all of our resources and work on LGBTQ equality, and welcomingschools.org, where you can find the Welcoming Schools programs, resources, and contact information. I also recommend that you check out the Dads for Transgender Equality videos, including both the video that includes JR and a number of other dads, as well as JR's own video. It's incredibly important and moving and powerful. And I just want to, again, thank you all for your support, your participation, and your continued effort to make sure that all of our schools are welcoming and safe for everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. And until next time, have a wonderful day and a wonderful week.